Now, today, I will give you a talk on Quo Vadis. Where does ethnobotany go? Where is it going? Where do we want it to go? Because there are a lot of discussions going on. Can you all hear me well?
Yes, we
Perfect.
can hear you.
So, as you see, I have a double appointment right now. Currently, I'm here in Karlsruhe in Germany, but also I hold also a professorship in Georgia in the Caucasus. And I'll get to that a little bit later. But I'll give you a very short background where I come from. I'm actually a botanist, so a taxonomist and vegetation ecologist. I did my early work in East Africa on Main Mountain. So this is Mount Kenya there, where I did vegetation work in the forest zone. So classic phytosociological study on forests, very nice, very colorful. And on a long run, very useless, because this is how the forests looked like after I published my thesis. Not my fault, but of course, those forests are being used. And as a young phytosociologist and taxonomist, I had nothing whatsoever to do with ethnobotany. So I'm not originally a trained ethnobotanist, if you want. But I had to learn that there are actually people who are using resources, and that it might be really interesting to talk to these people to see how their knowledge and their livelihood needs, of course, could be reconciled with conservation and better forest use. Which brought me to ethnobotany, first in this yellow thing in northern Peru and southern Ecuador. I was actually invited to do botanical work there, so I came there as taxonomist to identify everything that was there. So I would say this is a pretty standard way of becoming an ethnobotanist. You come out of another discipline and then you slip into plant use without actually at the beginning thinking about doing that. Why is this so interesting? There's a huge gradient from the Pacific Ocean, very dry. You saw that El Nino is building again, so a very strange desert environment, to the Amazon basin, which of course is very wet. This is only a gradient of about 20 kilometers across part of the region. So you see desert-style parts on the left and very, very wet, like 12,000 millimeter mountain forests on the right. So interesting region to start out, because there's a lot of plant use, of course. Here just a few examples of food plants and medicinal plants. A lot of you might know cat's claw, the bark in the lower right. And this use has been going on for thousands of years. So there are old archaeological records about plant use. This little vase has, for example, nectandra seeds depicted. Everybody goes to traditional healers. And of course, this makes it an ideal study region where we started out with classic ethnobotanical studies, which is basically documenting what is there and what is being used, which is what a lot of us started out with. And this just shows a little idea about antibacterial use there. As you see, most species with traditional use actually are indeed antibacterial species, and species that are not used by local people for that purpose also don't work. This is just a little bit to quickly show that people know what they're doing. However, and of course, there are huge markets. Everybody is selling herbs. There are hundreds of species in trade. So it looks like incredible, in quotation marks, traditional knowledge, lots of stuff going on. And you might think that this is all going back a long time and all very traditional and so on. If you compare old drawings to plants that are still in the market, you can see that actually the same stuff has been there in parts for a couple of 100 years. But if you look closely, you will see that most species that are sold are actually introduced species. So chamomile, eucalyptus, rue, this is all stuff that has been introduced to South America. And very, very, very few species made most of the market volume, which of course has interesting conservation implications. And this is one example why traditional ethnobotany is still important. We need to know what is there, because otherwise we cannot further hypothesize about how to use this stuff in the future, what to do with it, whether it contributes to livelihoods, whether it has conservation implications. And most of ethnobotany nowadays in many parts of the world is actually urban. This is a picture from La Paz in Bolivia. And if you think Bolivia, you think Amazon forests and small indigenous communities and so on and so forth. But 85% of the population of Bolivia is urban. And this is the same in many Latin American countries. Take big cities like Lima or Bogota. A lot of the population has moved to the capitals. And of course, they bring their plants. They bring them to the markets. And the question is, does that change plant use or not? Are these markets stable? What is going on? And in another classical study, we had the chance to look at markets over a decade in the city of La Paz to see what happened there. And in that very, very, very short time, we actually did see changes. So if you look at the left, the plant inventory didn't change much over 15 years, but the use of plants changed tremendously. So although people are using the same plants, they use them for different purposes. And that, of course, has a lot of reasons. And it also shows that in, again, quotation marks, traditional knowledge always changes. It's not stable. It's not at all something that remains intact over hundreds of years. People learn very, very quickly. And if you look at what plants are used for and how that changed in the last couple of decades, you see that thing, kidney infection, very, very up in the right corner. This has very simple societal reasons. Dress codes have changed, especially in women. And there are very few public toilets. So especially for women, it's very hard to do their business out there, which leads to more kidney infections. And at the same time, traditional allopathic antibiotics don't work against most bacteria that are responsible for kidney infections in Bolivia. So what do people do? They use new plants. And that's, again, a reason why classic studies are so important, because we have to see what is going on in the market. And that has very important implications for public health, because the huge problem nowadays is the replacement of species. So all of you know horsetail, Equisetum, of course, below. But there are species in Bolivia that look kind of similar. Equisetum is getting rare because of urbanization. So what do people do? They try to find a replacement, which is in this case ephedra, because it kind of looks similar. So people thought, yeah, let's take that stuff. Let's now call it also horsetail. So the name of a species changed, the traditional name, and without good botanical knowledge, you might not even realize that that is the case. And such things are huge public health problems, because ephedra is causing urinary problems if you take a lot of it. So people use a plant that causes the problem they want to remedy. And this, of course, is calling for huge trouble. And we also have to ask ourselves if species that are traditionally used, for example, in Europe, like Equisetum arvense, are replaced with indigenous species in another country, are they bioequivalent? Do they actually contain the compounds that they should contain, or do they contain something completely different, which links, of course, ethnobotany to ethnopharmacology? And especially in South America, we could think that all these countries have the same colonial background, they have similar flora, so plant use should be the same. But as you see in 3 market studies in the capitals of the 3 big countries in the Andes, what people use is completely different. As you see here, a lot of different species in every country, and very, very few plants are used in the same way in all the countries. And worse, when we really look at use, there are lots of different uses in all places, and the common uses are very few. So if you hypothesize that here we have a flora that has been influenced by the same colonial impact, you're completely wrong, because something different happens in all the different countries, which has a lot to do with migrations, because all the migrants, of course, bring their own plants to the capitals, try to sell them, and then they're mixed up with other species. And of course, often other uses are being assigned. So this is where we go into a little bit more of quantitative ethnobotany, because the question is always, is there a loss of knowledge, and how do we study that? How do we know what's going on? It's always a huge topic saying traditional knowledge is getting lost, valuable potential new medicines are being forgotten or whatnot. And the question here was really, is this the case? And do we really only need scientifically trained ethnobotanists to study that? Because especially during COVID, there was no way to get to traditional local communities, first for protection of the communities, of course. And also we frequently don't have a lot of time to do our studies. So in this case, we found a tribe in Bolivia whose life has changed tremendously over the last decades. They were nomadic before, now they're settled, and of course have taken up Western clothing and so on. There were studies of these peoples going back to the 1910s. Some anthropologists were running around and noting some plant uses. Some botanists in the 1980s had forest plots and also tried to find what was going on with regard to use. So we said, well, why don't we look at whether knowledge really got lost, or whether people still know what's going on. So we started a project teaching local school teachers to do ethnobotanical studies. Background, this is one of those isolated tribes that are actually a remnant of original peoples that were almost exterminated during the rubber boom in South America. Most were enslaved, died during that time. Some got to isolated places. So this is a very small tribe, 350 adults. They do have a nice big territory now again that they occupy. As I said, lots of anthropological visit and ethnobotanical studies. So we said, well, let's look what happened. So these 12 local trained guys, of course, spoke the local language, were always there, could collect when something was flowering, could do interviews with a lot of time. They were extremely enthusiastic in doing that after being trained in all aspects of ethnobotanical work. And they actually interviewed the whole tribe in 1 year. So I don't think there's another example where a whole tribal group has been interviewed completely. And of course, we thought at the beginning lots of knowledge was lost in 100 years and so on, and asked which factors do influence the knowledge there. And if you look at informant consensus, one of those very common metrics we use, you see that the informant distribution is very nice and equal in different age categories, gender, and so on. And in red, you see that people actually have a very broadly distributed knowledge. Everybody knows essentially everything. And keep in mind the word knows, because I will get to that a little bit later again. Now, if we look at all the indices we use, well, first of all, we see that community is the most important factor for what people know. Well, where you use what you find where you live. So depending on which village you are, you will use different plants. And this is reflected in informant consensus. And that also says you have to be very careful with extrapolations, because every village is different, no matter if it's the same ethnic group. And you also have to keep in mind the historic context, because what's interesting here is that the age group around 50 at that time had the most limited knowledge. Why is that so? Because these guys grew up when American Christian missionaries started to work with the tribe and prohibited any plant use. So they did not learn as much as people before, but you can see that their children recover traditional knowledge, because as soon as the missionaries were gone, plant use came back. So this is something to keep in mind. But if you look at different indices, you also see that different plants have different importance. So Vismia, for example, has the highest use value because it's used, for example, in construction and so on and so on. So it's one multi-purpose species. But if you look at use diversity, Cedrela will have most different uses. And now think about using only one index for a study that maybe has conservation implications. Depending what index you use, you have very different results as to which species are the most important ones. So very much care has to be taken in interpretation of these indices. And they're very interesting, but one index alone does not tell anything about what's really going on. And it also depends, of course, on the interviewer what we learn, because, well, you have all these local guys who are talking. So we ask, well, is there an interviewer effect? Do interviewers influence the study subjects? And here in gray are the academic trainers. So this is us studying local people. And in white are the local interviewers. So you can actually see that they were very well trained. They got about the same amount of data that we would get as academically trained ethnobotanists, just to show that you can actually indeed train local people to do ethnobotanical studies in their own villages. And of course, every interviewer does influence people they talk with. So here the circles basically show where the interviewer is located and where the answers of the people they interviewed are. So there's definitely an influence on how questions are being asked. So, and that, of course, is nivellated if you have a lot of participants in a study. Of course, we also asked, do you need very experienced interviewers or not? What happens if somebody knows a lot, somebody knows less? And the guys who themselves had a lot of knowledge are the ones in light blue. And it shows that actually the most knowledgeable locals did the worst interviews because they were simply bored, because they already knew everything and didn't really want to talk to people who didn't know a lot. And then, of course, we also asked, how should we do interviews? Because we call that most ethnobotanical studies have like 30, 40, 50 participants and are free list studies. So what works best, free listing or a more defined study? We looked at palms, so very easy to talk about all species. And of course, people also mention palms in free lists. And as you see, for the palm study, we already had about 90 participants. This is the blue line. And to reach the detailed knowledge we got in the palm study, we needed over 300 participants in a free list study. So if you do free listing, you need a heck lot of people to actually get good results. And this is what a lot of ethnobotanical studies lack. You also get completely different species assemblies. Blue, important palm species with all their specific uses. Orange is the free listing stuff. So if people free list, you get a lot of different data, much more than if you use a specific study, because everybody talks about what they prefer. And accidentally, we did a lot of repeat interviews. Some people were asked twice, well, first in the palm study, then in a free list study, but also by different interviewers. So if you talk to the same person 2 times, you might get very different results. So something to keep in mind. You see, they diverge quite a lot. And results also differed very much from the palm study, that's to the right, to the free list study to the left. So even the same people gave much less information when they could free list. This is to keep in mind that you really have to think about how you do a study. So was there a knowledge loss? Or was it just research methods that simulated a knowledge loss? Well, it was the research methods. The anthropologists got way less results than the trained botanists because they focused on whatever was in the house or around the garden and never went to the forest. So very frequently, knowledge loss can be an artifact of research methods, and this is what we have shown here. Essentially, all the uses that were ever reported are still or were still there, plus a lot that had not been reported. So something to keep in mind on how we should do ethnobotany. And of course, our study, the blue one, contained all the species that were found, apart from some that were found by the botanists only in specific forest plots. Very simple, those were species that were not really used. So if you do a good ethnobotanical study, you can really easily get all data that other people have missed. And was the stuff still there? Well, yes, see those arrows in the 1980s, we could still find them, but this is the difference between knowledge and usage. People know how to make those things, but nobody uses them because it's much easier to hunt with a gun. Same with baskets. Baskets are the same as 100 years ago, but very few people know how to make them, and you don't use those, you use plastic bags nowadays. And we had even an influence in the study, because you see that chair in the upper left, and then our researchers found a similar chair 100 years later. Well, the effect is probably that they looked into a publication that we gave them and then redid the chair themselves to show that it still existed. So even ethnobotanical studies can have an effect, because we show frequently what was there before, and people might recover it, whether it's useful or not. Of course, nobody uses these chairs. And that was an effect of repatriation. We always try to give knowledge back. Think Nagoya Protocol, all data should get back to the original owners. So we try to have the communities as authors. We acted as editors in all publications, translated everything that had been published before from English, German to Spanish, so that people had a record. And this went into a book that really showed all the studies that have been done in 100 years. And as effect of the new study, people themselves, under our guidance, published a new guidebook about their ethnobotany in the 21st century that exactly contains all the data we gathered. So repatriation then, of course, very important, but this takes time and money. And now we transfer that to my second home, which is Georgia. Lots of different groups, most speaking Georgian, lots of other languages. So we did a study in the whole country, and again, found that plant use very much overlaps. So in essence, everybody uses the same plants, save some additional species that grow at higher altitudes. So of course, if you're in the mountains, you have some different species. And again, it was very important to see where people lived. Depending which village you're in, you use different plants. This is very logical. Very little differences when it comes to gender and so on. But keep in mind, these are mostly older people, because all the young guys live in the capital and not anymore in the villages, and might know about plants, but they will never use it themselves. So this is really something we always forget, that use knowledge and real application are two very different shoes. And of course, lots of plants are grown in gardens, lots are wild collected. The reason they have lots of plants in gardens is not traditional. It's an influence of the Soviet Union, because people had very small plots to work in. And of course, they tried to cram everything in there that they might use. And there's a huge difference. I mean, garden plants have a higher use value. Everybody needs them, for example, for food. But forest species have a much higher use diversity and have a higher cultural value. So if you use only one index, you also, again, might miss that forest species are really important. And this, of course, has conservation implications. And it also depends on how you ask your questions. For botanists, it's sometimes very difficult to step in the shoes of anthropologists and ask the correct questions. And we saw that when we asked about the use of potatoes, because everybody uses potatoes, as you can see above, but very few people use potato leaves as a vitamin source in spring. And they're, of course, toxic. They don't taste very well. And we first thought, well, only communities at high altitudes, of course, use potato leaves in spring. But then there was these lower guys, and we found that actually we're migrants. So unless you know where people come from, you might interpret your data completely wrong. So this is the same people who moved to a lower altitude and said, oh, of course we know how to use potato leaves. Of course we don't use it because it tastes terrible, but it is an old tradition. So here then we go to the question, where do we go? Because there are lots of discussions in ethnobotany right now. How should it be done? Should we still do traditional studies, or should we only test hypotheses or whatnot? First of all, we do believe that we have to apply the Nagoya Protocol. So local counterparts and colleagues do need to get involved in research and publications at all levels. And we also have to recognize that ethnobotany needs to become much more international, because especially the old, large English-speaking institutions in the US or Europe and the traditional societies have much less influence nowadays, because most of ethnobotany actually happens now in the countries where people hold knowledge, be it China, Pakistan, India, and so on. That is, lots of studies are actually done in-country long-term using or working with in-country scientists. And that, of course, has changed the landscape of ethnobotany completely. Now what we see is an increasing rejection of field-based studies. But we really believe that documentation is still extremely important as a basis for further interpretation. Although there is this increasing push to statistical analysis using all these indices that come out of ecological studies. However, as I already showed, using one index makes absolutely little sense. If we use indices, we really have to combine them and we have to interpret them very, very carefully. For example, if we do a study that involves traditional healers and lay people and then mix all that information, then of course we will have a very flattened distribution of knowledge. But if we separate those two groups, the whole thing will look very different. And there's also an increasing shift to hypothesis-driven studies, which is very interesting. But the question is it really what we should do on the long run? Because this is what we discuss right now. Should ethnobotany more decisively focus on hypothesis-driven research, able to turn findings into policy and abandon classical studies? And we say, no, actually not, because we do need classical studies as a basis for any decision-making. Hypotheses are nice, but if we don't have basic data, and we get that from documentation, we will not get to the correct conclusions. And there's a big if to all our studies. Ultimately, they should actually help to improve the livelihoods of the population whose knowledge we study. So if our results are not in some way applicable for the local population, then it makes relatively little sense to do that work. And I mentioned that already, we have to take very, very great care in interpreting all these indices, because the data are one thing, and it's nice to show those, but we do have to do the correct interpretation, because otherwise it does not serve too much. And of course, if we do hypothesis-driven studies, they must have a purpose and not just serve scientific ego, because we work with people here. And finally, on this one, we have to be very, very careful to distinguish between knowledge and actual use, because lots of people might know about the use of a certain species, but they might have never really applied it. They might have heard about a species under a certain local name, like horsetail, equisetum, and when they use it, they have no idea how this thing really looks like, because they always heard only the name and that it can be used for something, but they don't know how the species looks like. And this is really the biggest problem in current ethnobotany. And you see that I come from the taxonomic side. Ethnobotanical studies need solid botanical knowledge. So this is the correct taxonomic identification of plants. And this is really the biggest problem, because even many hypothesis-driven studies don't bother to actually look at the identification, at the correct identification of the species. And this is a huge problem, because vernacular names don't at the end say anything about the taxonomic identity of a species. So correct identification is hugely important, especially in Europe and the US. This is a real big problem, because most universities don't teach taxonomy anymore. For example, here in Karlsruhe, in botany, there is half a position. So a half-time person is teaching taxonomy for everybody at the university. And everybody wants taxonomists for many purposes, but nobody teaches about it. So where should we go? In my opinion, we should still do classic studies. We should carefully use indices, and hypothesis-driven work is important, but it should not be the only purpose of ethnobotany. And I think I have my half hour, so that's where I will stop, and will be open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk about ethnobotany and their conservation. And we can see now the world is changing from modern medicine to the traditional knowledge as well. So I will give the audience, if they have some question, let's talk, open discussion with Professor Bussmann. Any question, they can ask their question, just unmute their mic, or they can also can write their message in the chat box, and we will convey the question to both.
Hello, Maroof, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is hello, Professor Bussmann. This is Dr. Hidayat from Halle, Germany. So first of all, congratulations for a wonderful, very impressive talk. So I have general question, So in our hometown, like in Pakistan, in Parachina, like me and Maroof have same hometown, and we have a lot of medicinal plants. But the problem is that the old people who knows, how to use these plants are dying, there's no more. And the new generation don't care about these, these ethnobotany. So what should be done to preserve this and, this ancient knowledge of the plants? So what is your opinion? What should be done, What should we should do to preserve this knowledge, old knowledge?
Yeah, first of all, of course, we should document the knowledge. So this is where classical studies are extremely important. So we should know what is used, which species exactly are used, but we also have to look at harvesting times, harvesting locations, because we all know that compounds in a plant change depending where it grows. So the classic background, I think, is very, very important in that case. And then, of course, we should extrapolate from that on whether the applications of those species are indeed useful, because there are quite some interesting medicinal plant species, but there are also many that are not particularly useful. South America is a great example, because there, after colonizations, people simply started exploring all the flora they had to find remedies for new diseases, but whether that stuff really works or not is a big question. And in cases when we're, for example, outside antibacterial effects, we often see that the species do not work. So a very clear assessment of whether all those mixtures do work is important, because if something has no sense, then it might well be forgotten, because why keep that knowledge if it has no use? But documentation is really the first thing we do have to do. And then, of course, think about how we can maintain the species. So unless we get into conservation efforts, I mean, it's nice to know that something has a certain purpose, but if it's gone, it's gone.
Okay, thank you. Maroof, if you, just allow me, I have a very second short question, So, sir, what are the biggest challenges, for the ethnobotany around the globe? I know it will be big answer, just, just a few, challenges. What you feel, what are the biggest challenges, around the globe for the ethnomedicine?
Yeah, I would say there are two. One challenge is simply global change, because this is something that we have very little means to work against, and that, of course, can tremendously change the properties of plants. Again, thinking about medicinal plants in quotations, climbing up the mountain because it's getting too hot in lower altitudes, so we'll get different compound compositions and very possibly different efficacy. So global change is a huge problem. Global trade is a big problem, because that is much bigger than it used to be. So harvesting of interesting plants that are being traded worldwide, or something that looks similar. And then I go back to taxonomy. Lack of taxonomic knowledge is one huge challenge, because when I look at my students, we have less and less students who actually can identify a plant. And unless we very quickly train new taxonomists, we can do all base studies we want, but there will be nobody who can identify the material when it comes back to the back from the field. And that includes, of course, maintenance of good herbarium collections, because in many countries, and you're now in Halle, so Germany is not different. There is very little interest in herbarium collections, but we need those collections as comparative collections, and also, I would say, as compound libraries, because we can, of course, have a look at compounds in a couple of 100-year-old sample, if it's in good condition, and compare it to something from the same area nowadays. So maintaining old collections is something that is also very, very important and very problematic.
Okay, thank you so much. So once again, congratulations for a wonderful talk. And nice to know you are in our Germany. Hope to meet you at some point in Germany.
That would be very nice. Looking forward.
Wonderful. I mean, to invite a wonderful speaker.
Yeah, we have another question. I think so. We have another question from.
Thank you very much. I am Dr. Kamar Abbas from Karakoram International University, Gilgit. Sir, this area is famous from the Hindu Kush, Himalaya, and Karakoram Alpine and Alpine regions. We have a diversity of lingual and ethnical groups, and we have data regarding the ethnobotany that is in a research paper level, not in a published in a book form. So we are going to be ensure this data for the future generations in a book, as well as still the this area is a virgin regarding to make the flora of Gilgit-Baltistan, because this area is adjacent to the China, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and even India. So in this regard, what is your kind suggestion? Because the people of this area is before 20, 30 years before, this is the landlocked area and a great diversity of the flora. So kindly guide me in this area. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would say, again, one very important part is documentation, taking the historic perspective, meaning migrations and so on into account. And if at all possible, cross-border work, because borders might have huge influence in the knowledge of the same ethnic group on both sides of the border. So taking that into account and looking at the knowledge of the same people that live in different areas is highly important, because that gives you a lot of important insights also with regard to how knowledge has changed since a border came into place.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Pelger from Bhutan. I just want to ask the professor regarding the the status of ethnobotany knowledge usage with the emerging high technological and available resources like machineries and medicine at the 21st century. What will happen to this ethnobotanical knowledge, having a knowledge, but it is not being in use?
That is a very important question, and I think the COVID pandemic has given us partly an answer for that, because what I see globally is that due to lack of allopathic medicines to treat COVID at the beginning, or simply a shortness of allopathic drugs, lots of people went back to traditional knowledge to treat their COVID symptoms, and many governments were actually promoting the use of medicinal plants as in quotation, COVID remedies, and that around the globe. It was very, very common in South America. We saw lots of it in Europe. We also saw more and more interest in foraging, so more people want to go out and collect their own green food or whatever. So ethnobotanical knowledge can very fast become important again if there is any challenge to global health. But the big problem, of course, frequently was that people didn't know what they actually were collecting and what they were putting in their mouths. So this is one of the best examples why we need very solid ethnobotanical documentation and collection of species, because it is very likely that this knowledge will again be used if there is any challenge to official global health care.
Relating to the earlier question, is there any studies conducted on the usage of ethnobotanical, let's say, allopathic medicine and the modern medicine, as well as the modern technological, let's say, equipments and the traditional use of the equipments?
You mean in regard to efficacy or in regard to use?
Not efficacy, but in regard to the use.
Yes. Oh, yes, there is. We, for example, did a couple of studies in South America where we explicitly looked at patients at herbal healers and at patients in hospitals to see what kind of care they were using and what kind of care they preferred. And in fact, no matter whether people were at a traditional healer or in a hospital, they all used both allopathic and traditional medicine, depending on what problem they had. For example, one thing we saw was that people sometimes went to the hospital to get a diagnosis, and with the diagnosis, they went to the traditional healer to then get traditional medicine to treat their illness more holistically. So I think in many cases that use is interchangeable, and patients will go to both traditional practitioners and allopathic medicine to get the best results.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, anyone? Dosa.
Yes, actually following up with the precedent question, when we were kids, there were things that our parents told us about ethnobotany knowledge and like using traditional medicine, but they always say that we need to be cautious about the amount we take in, right? So I think this is really important aspect to look at, how to help the traditional knowledge to actually guide in terms of how or what is the amount of this particular plant or a mixture of plant one can take per day, or how the care should be. Because I think that's what's worried people, especially the young generation. Because for kind of modern medicine, we usually know the posology, but for ethnobotany, traditional use, we don't know the amount to take, and everything is perhaps cooked together, and we don't know how to take it. So is there a way to help to overcome this barrier?
I would say yes and no. One part, of course, is again the correct identification. The second part is to have documentation of recipes that can be recreated. So exact amounts, exact parts, but that's when it gets complicated, because harvest times, of course, have to come in there because compounds change during the year. Harvest locations come in there because, of course, the same species in a different environment will have different compounds. So it does get complicated very quickly. You're simply buying something in a package that has a certain name on it, on say on Amazon, it doesn't really do the trick. So traditional medicine is much more complicated than simply having the plant. And this is what a lot of people during COVID saw. They realized that what they were taking were either the wrong plants or wrongly collected plants. They didn't know how to prepare it. So this exactly is a huge problem that has to be addressed. But this is exactly why we need very good work on documentation of those species, so that it can actually come with the whole background. But as a story, when I was a kid, and I grew up in a region that used to be famous for healing. When I was a kid, traditional healing was something for the old women in the forest or so nobody was interested in it, because everybody took allopathic medicine. And the only people who brought back an interest in traditional medicine were actually hippies that moved to our region to buy farms. So they, in a way, rescued traditional knowledge. So foreigners, so to say, came in, started living there and brought traditional knowledge back. And when I came back to Germany now after 20 years outside, I was surprised that suddenly there were herbal books all over the place. So medicinal plant books, foraging books, and so on and so forth. So it's a big new movement. The problem is though that most of the people who use those books have no idea about the plants. So and that is something that seems to be fairly common in intervals, because one of my predecessors here, the first director at the herbarium 250 years ago, wrote a book on foraging in the region when there was famine. And same thing, people didn't know their plants, so they needed a book to learn again, and that was 200 something years ago. So it seems it repeats itself from time to time.
Okay, so maybe I think on that, using the modern technology to have kind of great photos with name on them may help people to know what they are taking as plants. And going back to the training, you mentioned something about there were no difference between people who were trained to be ethnobotanists and people who you guys trained to actually do. So how long did you train them?
Oh, we actually just did a two-week training session. So 2 weeks was enough to get them to a level where they could get good data. So that was very straightforward. But mind you, these were village teachers, so they had some background. Okay. But that made it very easy. Now I see two questions in the chat box that I'll try to answer quickly. Even one question is
in the chat box.
Major challenges, climate change or land use change. Those are both major challenges because they very much influence the availability and of course the compound composition of medicinal species. And I would say the loss of traditional knowledge has become less of a problem because there is really a lot of documentation. There is also a lot of older literature that has traditional knowledge documented. So when it comes to what was originally known, I think we have a good documentation. What we are learning now is more, how did these traditions change? And that, of course, is also something we really have to document. And the other question is why is how much of herbal medicine is safe? Dosa asked a little bit about that. And the reality is we don't know, because the same plant coming from different harvest locations might have different properties, different toxicity, different efficacy. So this is a question that is very hard to answer. What we do know is that most herbal medicine is not taken the whole life. And this is a big problem that modern society has to learn, where you don't take your traditional medicine preparation over a very, very long time, the same way you might take an allopathic pill for the rest of your life, say to lower blood pressure or whatever. So herbal medicine very frequently is carefully applied in certain circumstances, but not taken so long. And if you take it a long time, it might, of course, get toxic. And one question also goes to marketing. Well, why is herbal medicine not marketed broadly? One, of course, is restrictions when it comes to market something as medicine. Of course, a lot is traded as nutritional supplements. But then there's also the question of availability of medicinal plants, because a lot of species are simply not as widely available as would be required to have bigger markets. And this, of course, is a big problem when it comes to sustainable production of medicinal plants, because sometimes it's simply not possible to fulfill a market demand that some kind of flamboyant advertising might have created. And turning herbal medicine into something that gets into the more mainstream market is a long process. Example, here in Germany, you might find something that is called Umcaloabo in the pharmacies. This is a pelargonium extract that has been known for a bunch of 100 years from South Africa. And somebody in the 1920s marketed the stuff as tuberculosis cure, and then a company tried to turn it into remedy, a herbal remedy for respiratory infections. But getting that into the market, just getting it into pharmacies and the herbal as herbal product took about 20 years and a lot of money. So regulations have a major effect on how easy it is to market something.
May I have one question?
Thank you so much. Again,
So-
Professor?
Yes, sorry. I think this
Okay.
is really interesting discussion going on. You mentioned about where do we go for ethnobotany, and you mentioned about simulating international collaboration among other strategies. And we all know that the knowledge that we are getting about ethnobotany is usually local. How or what are the ways we could use to make this local knowledge attract people internationally?
Well, first of all, publish it. So I mean, we do have to keep publishing material. I think that's very important. And as I think serious publications, as journal articles, of course, but also broad, let's say, book or manual publications. Whether those are electronically available or not is another question. I mean, electronic is nowadays always easier because it's widely distributed. So publication is definitely highly important. And then, of course, we have always to ask the questions, should we really try to internationalize all traditional knowledge or traditional medicine that we see? And I think, first of all, we should maintain local applications, because locally we are very frequently still struggling with certain health problems. Take the example of Bolivia during the COVID pandemic. When the pandemic started, you couldn't even buy an aspirin because it was simply not available. So keeping traditional knowledge for local emergencies would be a first step. And then thinking about plants that might be interesting at a global scale, I think, is a second step. But also taking into account that actually a lot of species have been known for quite a long time and are actually already in global trade. Now, going back to South America, about 40% of all medicinal plants that are being traded or used are introduced species. So in a global market and in a globalized world, this goes very, very quickly. And maybe one last example for such globalization is, I did once an interview in Madagascar asking a mother about a remedy for diarrhea that she had given their child. So, where did you learn it? Grandmother or whatever. I said, oh, no, it was in the radio last Sunday. So we have to realize that knowledge gets around very, very quickly nowadays. Whether it's correct or not, that's a different question.
Thank you. I think there are still more questions in the chat box, and you may take your time to answer those.
Let me see. How can we preserve and transfer ethnobotanical knowledge? Well, again, first of all, by documentation, and then by publishing it, and publishing it in a way that is actually also interesting for young users. I mean, if I cannot use my smartphone to do something about traditional knowledge, then I will probably not look at it if I'm at a certain age group. So involving young people in documentation, of course, needs also to be done using modern technology. Otherwise, it's probably not going to work. Next question is the diversity of distribution of traditional knowledge in the work just like the model of biodiversity, and are tropical areas and subtropical areas higher than other areas? I would say no. The plant use in tropical areas, especially in very traditional societies, is actually more restricted than in societies that have been exposed to change for a long period of time. There are a couple of nice studies in South America about recently contacted recently, in quotations, contacted tribal groups that had a very, very limited number of medicinal plants they used in comparison to an extremely rich flora, which makes actually sense. I mean, you use what you know that works, and you don't want to experiment with a lot of plants that either don't work or poison you. Whereas in more temperate regions, with a more limited flora, it's easier to experiment. There are more cultural influences like agriculture, like livestock managing, that also might have led to a lot of diseases that have been treated for a very long time, meaning the environment has been changing more profoundly over a long period of time. So people always experimented more with medicinal plants. So I would actually say that a lot of less biodiverse areas at the moment show more use of plant species, because it's simply more easy to experiment with the flora. That's not saying that there is a lot of knowledge. There's not a lot of knowledge in biodiverse areas, but it's not really linked to the number of species available. Now another question is different species and parts used in different regions. Are there any instances that validate differences in medical efficacy? There are relatively few efforts, I would say, and not even in well-known species we have good studies on how their compound composition and thus efficacy changes across the globe. Nice example was this equisetum. Everybody around the globe uses equisetum, and everybody uses, broadly said, different species, and we have no idea whether the compounds are the same and whether the bioavailability is the same. Which is also something I always wanted to do as a study. On a global scale, lots of plant genera are used in different mountain regions. So the same genus is used in the Andes and the Caucasus and the Himalayas. But we have no idea about the compound composition of the different species. And although they're used for the same purpose, are they really equally efficacious? So this is a study that I wanted to do a long time, but I never got to it. But this would be a very nice collaborative study.
I think so. We will only take one question, short question, because it's almost very interesting. It's not seem to be end. One last question. And if you have any other question, you can also send email to Professor Bussmann.
Oh, of course, yeah, just send me always an email. And of course, I mean, I hope we get together with good food at some point to discuss all these questions, because this is the best way of doing it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Bussmann. Here is a very valuable session. I am Dr. Majid from Pakistan. My question is that how can we preserve the ethnobotanical knowledge and transfer of knowledge with the young researchers, adaptation as the cultural changes occurring drastically from the Asian countries, with the cultural and traditional aspects toward the modernization? How can we preserve and maintain the ethnobotanical knowledge and valuable plant species for our further generations?
I go back to documentation. So we do need very careful documentation. And then, of course, we also have to preserve the environment these plants grow in. And of course, also try to preserve or increase better the livelihoods of people who might use those plants, but without making them lose the knowledge, because better livelihoods also change their culture. So it's a very challenging environment, of course, but first documentation is really the key point. And I see that there's a question on biodiversity and traditional knowledge again. So no, I think really not that an extreme biodiversity also might foster an extreme traditional knowledge. Of course, it depends where you study, but really in very biodiversity, a very biodiversity rich region does not necessarily mean that there is extremely broad and extremely diversified traditional knowledge. And this depends much more, as I say, in every village. Every village is different. What is the key to traditional knowledge really? And I think one key is always the need to use a certain resource that is available. And if I do need to use a resource for a certain purpose, I will do that unless something easier, better, cheaper comes around, and then I will change to it. I mean, personal example, I would say I also take an aspirin. I do not chew salix bark because it's much easier to simply take an aspirin. I know, of course, that the same compounds are in salix or in filipendula, but use really depends on what is available and what is needed. And if something is easier, people always will use the easier one, especially in biodiversity rich areas where it's actually much more complicated to know all the species, and of course to know where and when I have to harvest.
I think so. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, boss.
Let me do one more. There's one. What about using artificial intelligence and ethnobotanical data? So I would say this is also a very good question. I think we can very well use artificial intelligence for the storage and analysis of ethnobotanical data. And of course, for comparison of large data sets and for modeling of future distribution of important medicinal plants. Maybe also for modeling of change in compound composition under certain environmental impacts. So their modern technology would be really interesting. The problem where modern technology doesn't work yet is taxonomy, because even here in Central Europe, we're trying a couple of plant identification apps just to see whether the stuff works. And they're, of course, only as good as the data they're fed in. So if wrong data are fed in, they don't work. And if it comes to closely related and hard to identify species, they also don't work. So you can't replace a good taxonomic botanist with artificial intelligence, fortunately.
I think so. There is no other more question, but if we give a chance to them, they will be asked more questions.
Yeah, just send
the
emails.
Discussion is so long and very interesting. And thank you so much, boss, again for your precious time, though you have very busy schedule, and give us the opportunity to give us a very wonderful talk. And we are also thankful to all the participants who are who gave us the time. I think so. Those I can also say something.
Yes, so thank you so much for your time. And
I have a suggestion that it is a very valuable discussion with the Professor Bussmann, the great and world-renowned professor in the field of ethnobotany biodiversity, and has the source of knowledge and support for the young generation and researchers all over the world. I request that such valuable sessions should be repeated after 15 days or in a continuous phase in a special form of special social media page, and we have connected all over the world to exchange our knowledge and can contribute our more effort more progressively in the form of publications, books, and other things.
Sure.
A platform to be created.
Yes.
So, we will
consider that, and also if we get the permission from Professor Bussmann, we will put the recording on YouTube so that people can listen to that, and if they have questions, they can contact Professor Bussmann as well. So thank you for your suggestion. And we usually have weekly meeting on different topics. So next week will be about seed ecology. So if you are interested, please join again, same time, same platform. Yeah, and see you next time. Thank you so much, and
Well,
enjoy your
thank
time.
you so
Thank
much
you
for
so
the
much.
invitation.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Maroof, for setting it up. This was great. I put my email in the chat box, so easier for people to find me. And of course, put it on YouTube and send me a link. And also, I love reminders about interesting sessions. So keep on sending those. And thank you for participating. And I hope it was interesting for everybody.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.